Thanks for listening to the program. I hope you'll support our guests by clicking on the book purchase link in this episode's description. Each purchase helps support local bookstores, and that's always a good thing.
Well, the Lost Battalion is somewhat of a misnomer, as often happens in history. And to summarize, the conglomeration of units had been separated from the main body of the 77th, and they ended up kind of fighting together. They were neither lost or were they a true battalion. They essentially were trapped and shot at by German troops who had surrounded them.
An excerpt from today's guest, who's written a book about how America's World War I soldiers came of age to defeat the German army. Author Mitch Yockelson is here, and I'll speak to him right after this break. This is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. I'm Robert Child. Today's guest is one of America's foremost experts on the First World War, a recipient of the Army Historical Foundation's Distinguished Writing Award, and an investigative archivist at the National Archives. His World War I book is called 47 Days, How Pershing's Warriors Came of Age to Defeat the German Army in World War I. And Mitch Yockelson joins us now. Mitch, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to reference a great review before we get started, and I'll read an excerpt here. Get ready to dig into one of the wildest and deadliest battles in history. The beautifully researched 47 Days takes you right there and shows you all the minute details, from the pings of a bullet to Pershing's confidence and fears. #1 New York Times bestselling author Brad Meltzer. That's very good. Excellent.
Yeah, I was very pleased and happy that Brad was willing to throw some comments on there. I had I did a book signing somewhere, and a guy came up to me and he said, your book was a two-flight book. I started reading it on the first flight, couldn't put it down. When I changed planes, I still couldn't put it down. To me, that was a really huge compliment.
Yeah, I would say I've never heard that term, but that's a great term. I've studied World War I a little bit myself. I'm no expert like you are, but I did a film in Canada on World War I, and Arthur Currie and the whole Canadian military force. We're going to talk today about Meuse-Argonne offensive. What were some of the challenges the first U.S. Army faced going into the battle?
Well, the obvious one was the fact that this was its first major battle as an independent army. As I touch upon in the book, just a couple of short weeks before, the U.S. First Army attacked in the Saint-Mihiel salient. So that was actually the first time Pershing has had an independent army fighting on its own, with the French assistance, of course. But then they had less than 2 weeks to prepare for a much larger battle on a much larger front with many more troops. And it was a situation where some of the units just had not been in combat already. Plus the fact it was getting into the autumn. And if you or any of your listeners have been to France in the autumn, you know it gets chilly, It gets wet. And then just like we're experiencing now, you had a second wave of the influenza epidemic. And so there were all these sort of issues, mostly just the inexperience in going against arguably the best army of its day, the German forces.
Yeah, that was one of my questions. Tell me a little bit about the German troops that the Americans were facing.
Well, oddly enough, most of the German troops that were in that sector of the Western Front, in between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, many of them were veteran units. Some of the troops have been there for the past couple of years. They had been transferred from the Eastern Front. So they actually hadn't been engaged in combat too much, but they were good. The German soldiers recognized the weakness of the Americans, and they fought back hard. even though the first day of the attack, it looked somewhat successful. The Americans had a really difficult objective as designed by General Pershing's operations officers, including Colonel George C. Marshall. But the Americans achieved a fair amount on the first day. And part of that was catching the Germans by surprise. But within the next day or two, when the Germans started reinforcing areas around the front, they became a formidable foe. And that's where things started to break down very early on in the attack. And we're talking, September 26th, 27th, 28th. And by the 29th, things were not looking real good for Pershing's warriors.
What kind of terrain was this? Trench warfare? It was an attack, but what was the terrain like?
The terrain itself, it still looks the same way today as I understand it. And I've been on that battlefield many times. It's very rocky. There's lots of steep ground, lots of ravines, lots of little brooks running through, and you're mostly going uphill, and you're getting fired upon by these German machine gun nests that are carefully placed. Right. So to answer your question in a nutshell, it's a horrible fighting ground. Not that any of the Western Front was ideal, but if you're going uphill against German machine guns, the defenders certainly have the advantage.
Yeah, that's for sure. When I did my film over in France, we did aerials over the battlefield at Amiens and other places, and it's really poignant to see all the cemeteries dotted in the fields, and all the cemeteries are on terrain that goes uphill because they were fighting uphill.
Yeah, if to kind of segue on what you just said, that's an interesting point. In most of the cemeteries you would have seen would have been British in that area.
Yeah, the Commonwealth.
And of course Canadian, any of the Commonwealth war graves cemeteries. And the CWG, as the acronym is, they buried the troops right there on the battlefields, right where they fell. Well, the Americans initially did that, and certainly in the Meuse-Argonne area, but the United States government had made a promise to the families of soldiers that if their loved one died overseas, they had the option of bringing them back or leaving them for perpetuity in consolidated cemeteries. Only about a third or so of the families elected to leave their loved ones overseas. And instead of keeping them in these smaller cemeteries like you see under the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, or even in the French system of burial, the Americans consolidated theirs into major cemeteries. So in the Meuse-Argonne area, you have the Romans Cemetery. Where you were in the Amiens area, you had the Somme and so forth and so on.
Exactly.
So you won't see small cemeteries of Americans.
No, we didn't, as a matter of fact. But we did go to a German cemetery. I believe it was called Langemark.
Yes, that's a very well-known cemetery just because it's heavily visited and it's one of the largest ones in the area. And you noticed, that they're completely different in their design.
Totally. It's stunning how different they are.
Yes.
Everything's black.
Yeah. And there's often more than one grave, one burial in each grave.
Yes.
Whereas the American cemeteries are always one. And the British are the same way. You have more than one burial on each plot.
And there's also a totally different atmosphere there. It's a very dark, heavy atmosphere at that cemetery.
Yes, even the headstones themselves are dark, whereas the ones in the British cemeteries and even the French, I don't want to say they're cheery, but they are bright white, and you can see them from a great distance away.
Yes.
Whereas the German ones are flat and they're dark, so you almost have to creep up on them.
We'll be back to the conversation after this quick break.
There's a storm a-coming. That deadly stillness right before a great battle. Leaves turned, is on the attack. He's got infantry moving, the main body in open country, and they're all concentrating this way. In the morning, he'll have skirmishers 3 deep and 70,000 men right behind them. The whole damn Rev army. They'll move through town, occupy those hills, the high ground, and there'll be the devil to pay. I've led a soldier's life, and I've never seen anything as brutally clear as this. It's as if it's already done, already a memory. But maybe we can hold them. Deny Lee the high ground.
Gettysburg, The Final Measure of Devotion. Streaming now on Amazon Prime Video. Now back to my conversation with Mitch Yockelson. Getting back to the Meuse-Argonne, tell us a little bit about the Lost Battalion, because that was a famous story, obviously, that occurred during this battle.
Well, the Lost Battalion is somewhat of a misnomer, as often happens in history. It was a conglomeration of companies from a few different regiments of the 77th in New York, the Statue of Liberty Division. Just very quickly, the U.S. Army was divided into the regular Army. So you'd have like the 1st Division, 2nd Division, 3rd Division. These were professional soldiers. Then you had, of course, the National Guard units. And then you had what were known as the National Army. And those were troops that, by and large, were from conscription. First World War was the first time the U.S. had instituted the draft since the American Civil War. So the 77th New York, the Statue of Liberty Division, they were had a lot of experience. They had fought in battles prior to the Meuse-Argonne, and they were given one of the toughest areas. They spent their entire time during the 47-day battle in and around the Argonne Forest, which is just this deep, dark forest that's heavily fortified. There are rail lines that run through it, where narrow gauge rail lines where the Germans would send supplies and troops and so forth. So they were essentially on the left side of the line and going through the Argonne Forest. And to summarize, the conglomeration of units had been separated from the main body of the 77th, and they ended up kind of fighting together. And they were led by a colonel, a New York, Major Whittlesey, a New York attorney. They were neither lost or were they a true battalion. Everyone knew they were out there. The 77th Division Commander, Major General Alexander, knew they were there. He knew, roughly how many men they were. The problem was that they were caught in this forested area. They ended up down in a ravine near a body of water, near a mine, the Charleville Mill. And they essentially were trapped and shot at by German troops who had surrounded them. And attempts were made by airplane to drop supplies because they knew they were running out. Whittlesey and his men were able to get carrier pigeons to send messages. While all this was going on, a newspaper reporter, and I will just a sort of sideline, one of the things that I enjoyed the most in researching the book was looking at newspaper accounts. You had a lot of embedded newspaper reporters that were allowed to basically be out in the front lines. But a reporter had gone to the 1st Corps, which it was under, and asked what was going on. And he heard about this battalion of men that were lost. And he contacted back in New York his editor, and they kind of coined the term, the Lost Battalion. But over 8 days, Whittlesey's men basically were just shot to pieces. They were badly wounded. They were starving. So only about a third of the men survived. Eventually, the First Corps commander at the time was Major General Hunter Liggett, who would go on to become First Army Commander later in the operation. But he devised a way to get these guys rescued, which they did. And it became kind of the story of the battle, along with, of course, Corporal, later Sergeant Alvin York, which is kind of interrelated into the same story.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about York. Obviously, he received the Medal of Honor.
Well, so did Whittlesey as well. York is a very interesting guy just because if you look at his background, he's from this tiny enclave in eastern Tennessee. He was older than many of the other soldiers. He was in his mid-20s by the time he went into the war. Did not want to go in. Registered as a conscientious objector. Was turned down. He filed an appeal. He was turned down again, and he ended up in the military, drafted, assigned to the 82nd, as they were known as the All-American Division. He ended up over in France. And as the story goes through the Gary Cooper movie, he was an excellent shot. He was with his men, and they got separated by most of the other troops in his regiment, and they were in an area by a rail line that was feeding into the Argonne Forest. And York ended up shooting and capturing more than 100 German soldiers and bringing them back to the rear as POWs. Now, there's a lot of controversy, as there are in all of these stories, of how much of this did York do on his own, how much of it was he assisted by other soldiers in his regiment and in his company. But the bottom line is, when York came back and he was marching these soldiers, and everybody said, yeah, you should see this guy York and what he did. Right. He was immediately put in for the Distinguished Service Cross. And that was the second highest decoration in the U.S. Army. And he did receive the DSC. After the war, the same sort of thing happened along the lines of the Lost Battalion, where a reporter writing for the Saturday Evening Post was looking for a good story. He was nosing around General Pershing's headquarters. Somebody on Pershing's staff had mentioned about this guy York. He went over to the 82nd, learned about him, and then Pershing heard a little bit more and wanted to create heroes for the war.
Right.
And York was a great story. This conscientious objector who goes into the military, and he captures more than 100 German POWs. And so the story just kind of grew from there. They went back to the site where this took place. York had a vague idea approximately where the Germans were. And the story grew into the Saturday Evening Post, and Pershing authorized him to have an upgrade from the DSC to the Medal of Honor. And he became, in a sense, the hero of the United States Army of World War I.
Yeah. You still hear about him today, obviously.
Yes.
What did the battle accomplish? What were the strategic accomplishments?
Well, without a doubt, the fact that the Americans fought in this battle, and we're talking about more than 1 million, roughly about 1.2 million, they helped turn the tide of the war. And by fighting in the Meuse-Argonne area, they eventually broke through. It took, out of the 47 days, it took more than 30 for the Americans really to get a foothold. Pershing, who was leading both the entire American Expeditionary Forces and the Tactical First Army, relinquished control of First Army, made Hunter Liggett, the guy I mentioned a short time ago, commander, and that was a brilliant move. And Liggett reorganized First Army. He actually even created a second army, and that gave the Americans the impetus. And at this point, the Americans were also getting reserves, replacements. The Germans weren't, and they were worn down. So by the early part of November, it was obvious to the Germans that there were plenty of Americans out there, and they knew that more Americans could come from the United States. And if they continued the war, they would be soundly defeated. So really their only really their only decision to make was, let's call for an armistice and hopefully we can get some sort of agreement that won't defeat us entirely. So, in a nutshell, again, it was the Americans, just in sheer numbers, who really helped turn the tide of the war.
Yeah. Well, the book is called 47 Days, How Pershing's Warriors Came of Age to Defeat the German Army in World War I. Mitch, thank you so much for being on the show today.
You're welcome, Rob. I really appreciate it.
We do as well. That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. Next time, my guest will be multi-million selling author Martin Dugard, who will discuss his latest book, Taking Paris, the epic battle for the City of Lights.
Because we started with killing Lincoln, and there were a number of books about the assassination. Lincoln is one of the most widely written about individuals in history. People liked it. And then about six weeks after it came out, Bill called me and said, let's do book 2, Killing Kennedy.
That's next time. And stay up to date with all the upcoming guests. Sign up for the Point of the Spear pipeline at robchild.net. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.
I wanted to take a moment to thank our growing army of listener-supported members. You make it possible to continue our mission of bringing you the best military history authors, filmmakers, and movers and shakers. If you're not a member yet, it's easy to join. It just takes seconds. Scroll down to the bottom of this episode's description and click the support link. You'll come to our anchor page, click the support button, then complete the brief form. It's that easy. We're planning loyalty perks and giveaways to roll out over the coming months for our early supporters who sign on before the end of the year. So don't wait. Become a member today, and thank you for your support.